Welcome to SpunTales.com, where we spin tales from around the web. This season, we have a new story from author J.D. Phillips. An advanced copy of The Fallen by J.D. Phillips was provided to SpunTales.com with permission to read on air. Be sure to follow our socials at Facebook.com/AuthorJD and Twitter.com/JD_author. The Fallen by J.D. Phillips. Part 1. The world as he last recalled it consisted of waves of vibrant red, black, and indigo. Pulsing swells of energy, both hungry and giving, pushed and lashed out at him as he struggled to find some sort of calm within the storm. Everything and nothing made sense as he reached as far into the abyss as a soul could in hopes of finding something, anything, on the other side solid enough to grab onto before he fell in. He remembered nothing between then and now, for an almost blinding blue-white flash of light shining all around as well as within. He was simply caught in the storm one second and lying flat here on a cold bed, hard as cement the next, seemingly quick as a blink, though he had no way of telling how much time had actually passed. He couldn't, in fact, discern much of anything at the moment. The room around him was dark, still, quiet. Too quiet, really. It allowed him to hear the pounding of his own heart within his ears, hard and swift, as though the organ had just undergone some great shock despite the fact he wasn't the slightest bit out of breath. The air around him felt cold and heavy, thick, close. He sensed the surrounding walls were much too close. So much so he could reach right out and touch them if he only dared to try. Thousands of tiny needles pricked and burned beneath his skin as he willed his left hand to crawl out from under the blanket covering his body. The blanket was thin, little more than a sheet really, but the fabric rubbed rough against his arm nonetheless as he managed to raise it up to freedom. It was his arm, he knew that. It escaped the blanket when he told it to. The hand flexed and balled into a fist to chase stiffness from the fingers on command. And yet, he couldn't help but notice a nagging sense of disconnect, numb and heavy, between himself and the limb. Almost as though it was more like some ill-fitting glove than flesh and bone. He felt with too sharp certainty the smoothness of his skin as he called upon the right hand to lift and land upon his chest beneath the blanket. There were no obvious scars as best as he could tell, no apparent reason for the growing uneasiness within the chest, other than the fact that his body felt like that of a stranger. Not overly toned, but fairly fit. He gathered a number of details through touch alone, but none called any images of himself to mind. He ordered the left hand to land upon his cheek and found similarly smooth skin. No stubble, no heavy wrinkles, no scars. Full lips, a sloped nose, a soft brow, messy half-curled waves of hair upon his head. The details were all there, beneath his fingertips, but they meant nothing to him. His face was as blank as the darkness around him, and the air even heavier with every breath he took. It occurred to him he ought to do something, but what exactly was one to do in such a situation like this? He thought to sit up, but then, aware of the unnatural closeness of the walls, opted to reach his hands out to either side instead. He reached as he reached beyond the storm, only this time his hands hit upon walls as cold and hard as the bed beneath him, mere seconds into their journey. What was this? Instinct demanded he reached above as well as beyond his head, both attempts garnering the same results. This was not a room, he realized, but a box, and that caused his heart to quicken for reasons he wasn't entirely sure of yet. He needed to get out, he supposed, but couldn't think of how he ought to go about making his escape. In the end, He pushed against the wall directly behind his head until he felt the entire bed beneath him roll forward. He came to an abrupt stop as metal clanged against metal and winced as the sound echoed loudly all around him. The ringing evoked within his ears was so great, he was only vaguely aware of a muffled voice cursing somewhere just beyond the box. Someone outside. Someone who may free him. The pain of lifting his leg in order to kick at the metal his bed had rammed up against was great, both from the needles of pain which fired from toe to thigh and the second shrill clanging as his kick pushed his bed up against the wall nearest his head. But the effort proved successful. Seconds after a series of muffled curses just barely reaching his ringing ears, there was a loud metallic click and a flash of light nearly as blinding as the one he'd seen before he woke here flooded every inch of the box around him. He couldn't bear to open his eyes against the intensity of the light, even when he felt his bed being rolled forward so quickly it almost made him dizzy. A second heartbeat became audible, this one beating far faster than his own, while labored, panting breaths sounded directly above him. Soon, a sort of shade fell across his face as someone leaned in to take a closer look at him. The shadow made it safe for him to open his eyes. The scream took him by surprise. Not his. He was certain no sound had passed from his own throat, but he felt it inside himself nonetheless. Fear and horror. But there were softer things mixed in with the sounds as well, like sympathy or maybe even remorse. He was still struggling to comprehend the nature of the scream, even as he looked to locate the source of it. A heavy-set young man with tan skin and curly dark hair, doing all he could to avoid contact, loomed above, casting the much-needed shade over his face until contact was made. And the scream somehow managed to climb an octave higher. He'd only stared the screaming man in the eye for a few seconds before the man turned on his heel and ran away, screaming now for someone named Randy. The light attacked his eyes the instant the screamer moved away, forcing him to cover his face with his hand as he processed what to do next. The air here was warmer and less claustrophobic, but he still felt odd, uncomfortable, cold. Sitting upright on the hard bed proved more difficult than expected, but only because his muscles were stiff and reluctant to do as commanded. Blips of pain stabbed and radiated along nerve endings all over his body, but once he was up, he found it easy to swing his legs over the side of the bed. Or perhaps table was more like it, he thought, squinting at the shiny silver surface directly beneath him. The light was easier to take, now that he was no longer directly facing it. Easier still once he had turned his gaze to the room rather than the metal below. Easier, yes, but still unpleasant as he struggled to focus upon the darkness in the corner. Not that there was much to look at, really. Plain white and mint green tile spanned the walls and the floors. Cabinets and odd tables of metal with drains and a desk in the distance were the only furniture to be found. The space he'd been pulled from looked a lot like a cabinet too, he thought. One of many square spaces stacked into rows along the wall. There were too many cubes, all but his closed up tight with shiny metal doors. He wondered briefly if there were others like him inside any of them. But the room was silent now, and the screamer had dashed away into the hallway beyond, and somehow he doubted the screaming was a usual sort of reaction. No, there weren't others like him. He was alone here. Thank you for listening to SpunTales.com. The Fallen was written by J.D. Phillips and given permission to SpunTales to read on air. SpunTales.com is a Heathen Digital podcast. If you'd like to start a podcast or are interested in being on a podcast, contact us at info@heathendigital.com. If you're an author and you'd like your story read on SpunTales, send us an email at info@spuntales.com. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter, facebook.com/spuntales or twitter.com/spuntales. And thanks for listening.